Now, whether governments have more influence over the civil society or whether civil society has more influence over government has been a bone of contention for at least, I think, 300 years, so we're not going to solve that this afternoon. But it's not difficult, even in the brief account I've given you, to see how each affects the other in important ways. It's clear that civil society is one of the keys to democracy. But democracy doesn't necessarily lead to effective governance, and effective governance doesn't necessarily lead through into the achievement of peace and social justice. We have to be clear about that, right? So let's go a little bit further in the analysis and ask ourselves an even more complicated question. How do different or shifting patterns of associational life help or hinder the realization of good society goals? And what can we do to revive the public sphere if we believe it's an important transmission mechanism between those two? That's a question that generates a very rich agenda for discussions, but it's very complicated. There's no consensus on the answers. The evidence is very muddy. It's extremely dependent on the experience of the United States, which is where the literature largely comes from. But there are broadly three schools of thought. There's the social capital school. Bob Putnam, who I'm sure you've read, is the high priest, I would call him, of the social capital school. They see associational life in general as the driving force behind the positive social norms on which the good society is founded. Things like cooperation, trust, and reciprocity. Remember, I talked at the beginning about voluntary associations as microclimates in which those positive attributes might be developed. That's what Putnam believes. So the logical policy, if you believe that, is to encourage as much volunteering, as much voluntary action as possible, even if some of it, as it will be, is used for what you might consider to be uncivil purposes, or purposes that you would judge as bad, because you can't control that. Putnam would say somewhat magically, in my view, somewhat akin to the hidden hand of the marketplace. Those differences will work themselves out in a general scheme of things, so you don't need to worry about them. The fact that there are uncivil groups, the fact that there is negative social capital, the fact that people are volunteering to do bad things shouldn't worry you very much, because in the end of the day, it will sort itself out. Not very convincing, I don't think. So the second school, which I think is an advance on Putnam, what I would call the comparative associational school, they say it doesn't really matter just to have lots of people doing lots of different things and hoping for the best, Bob. What you need is particular configurations of associational life, which are the key to securing the public policy reforms the good society requires. That's the secret. That's the way to answer the question. In the United States, I think that's quite a powerful explanation, because we know that nationally federated mass membership, cross-class, cross-geography groups, think about labor unions, think about parent-teachers associations, think about the American Legion and so on. They've declined dramatically over the last 50 years, since 1945. And they used to provide strong bridges which brought lots of different Americans together across the lines of interest group and forged coalitions which were strong enough to force through major episodes of social policy reform, like the GI Bill of 1944, which had very large generalized social welfare effects throughout American society. What's replaced them? A burgeoning array of single-issue advocacy groups, largely based in Washington, D.C., incapable of fashioning a social consensus broad enough to force through significant change in the contemporary polity of America. And I think that's not completely true, but I think there's an element of truth in that. So that school would say, in the New Zealand context, or whatever, in whichever context, look for the particular configurations of associational life that you think are most important in leading to the public policy reforms that characterize the nature of the good society. There's a third school of thought. I call them the skeptics. They don't see any reliable link at all, empirically, between the structure of civil society and its achievements. In other words, they would say you can never predict the larger scale outcome of voluntary activity. It's simply impossible, so don't even try. And not surprisingly, they don't have that much to offer the discussion about policy and practice, apart from it's all very complicated and do no harm. That's probably a best summary. They would say, let the internal mechanisms of civil society work out these questions by themselves. You don't need to worry about it. People will do that for themselves if they have voice and security. Now, none of those positions are completely convincing, especially in a cross-cultural context. And obviously the appropriate policy depends on which position we subscribe to. And that provides us with a very nutty dilemma, nutty meaning hard, not crazy, especially because we know that interventions by donor agencies rarely, if ever, lead to predictable outcomes, something I suspect is even more true for this discussion on governance. The easiest things to influence, like the number of NGOs, may be the least important in determining long-term progress, while the most important things, changes in civic and political values and relationships that we're talking about, are the least amenable to external influence. So there's no doubt if you accept the analysis I'm unravelling here, it leaves us in a bit of a tight spot. There's people who want to do something. There's people who want to spend money or make grants or organise people. Because what the hell do we do? There just seems to be this, canvas of complexity in front of us, and it can paralyse us if we're not careful. So we don't want to fall for paralysis, but we do need to be extremely careful in moving to the next stage, from theory to action, which is what I'm going to talk about. I think, without being too critical, if you look at what I would call the civil society building industry that's proliferated since 1989, with some exceptions, it resembles a very crude attempt to manipulate associational life in line with Western, and specifically North American, liberal democratic templates. That's the reality. Pre-selecting organisations that donors think are most important. I think David said earlier on, advocacy NGOs or other vehicles for elites, usually based in the capitals. Ignoring domestics of citizens that don't conform to Western expectations. Informal, village, clan-based associations, radical social movements, pre-political formations, for example. Spreading mistrust and rivalry as fledgling civic groups have to compete with each other for foreign aid and sometimes distance themselves from the social base. Creating a backlash when associations are identified with foreign interests, which makes them even more vulnerable to cooptation and control. It's not a pretty picture. The creation of public spheres is usually ignored completely, despite the importance that I gave it, apart from occasional support for independent media groups and organisations promoting government accountability. Ignoring Ralph Dahrendorf's warning that it takes 6 months to create new political institutions, 6 years to create a halfway viable economy, and 60 years to create the beginnings of a civil society. 60. Project timescales are collapsed into what you and I know, the bread and butter of our world, bite-sized 2 or 3 year chunks, and accountability is reoriented upwards. So we want you to build a civil society by December the 31st, 2003. And we want to see the audit trail while we're at it. Nurturing civic institutions, meaning values and practices and not just the organisations, takes the most careful and sensitive accompaniment over very long periods of time. By contrast, our industry, the aid industry, resembles a bulldozer driven by someone convinced they're heading in the right direction, but following a map made for another country at another time, but enthusiastically driving as quickly as possible. So what do we do? So in the final 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about some of the more concrete issues. Despite all of that complexity and contingency, which I want us to hold on to, there are some things we can do. You can breathe, thank goodness. I'm not going to lay even more on it. There are some things we can do, despite all those admonitions. And the first one is to work simultaneously on what I would call both sides of the governance equation: supply, meaning state transformation, and demand, meaning civil society development, so that one doesn't become an ideological substitute for the other. And in the practice of many development agencies, I'm afraid that is what has happened, not NZAID, I don't think, certainly in the United States. We're still in the era of government retrenchment, with civil society being seen as a substitute for the state, which is completely crazy. At Ford, we use a simple definition of governance as the exercise of democratic authority over matters of public concern. That's it. That's the only definition that we have, and it's just those words. Governance is the exercise of democratic authority over matters of public concern. You don't have to accept this. I'm just saying this because it's important to what I'm going to say next. And in democratic polities, authority derives from structures of the state that protect basic human rights and enforce the rule of law, while legitimacy derives from structures of citizen participation that express collective aspirations and hold public power to account. So all systems of governance have to balance authority and legitimacy in ways appropriate to the context. And I think our role as donor agencies is to help in that process, but not direct it, by supporting actors across society to address the long-term challenges of institutional development and relationship building in the civic and political arenas. In the somewhat ideal sense, I realise, our long-term goal is to promote the simultaneous and interlinked development of an inclusive associational ecosystem where everyone has a place, matched by a strong and democratic state which fulfills its responsibilities, in which a multiplicity of independent public spheres enable equal participation in setting the rules of the game. If I was to pin that up, that's what I would recommend pretty much to everyone as the long-term goal, which I know is a bit of a mouthful.